The Hypershade is a really powerful part of Maya, and it's really the backbone of the shading. We can access the Hypershade by clicking on the ball icon, the ball with a little hole on it, next to the render settings. This brings up the Hypershade, and it's comprised of a few different areas. What we're going to be looking at mostly is going to be the material tab and textures. This is where we have all the materials in a scene and all the textures in a scene. We can see we only have one file, and that's currently an HDRI. And then we have all the materials. Here are all the materials in the scene, though not all of these are made by us. We always have a few default materials, so these will always be here. And then here are the ones we've actually made. Then under the create menu, this is where we can actually create new nodes. And these might be texture maps, or they could be different shaders. We have all sorts of things. We're mostly going to be concentrating on what's on our Arnold, because this is where most of the new nodes live. If it has AI in front of it, that means it's an Arnold node. If it doesn't, well, it's not an Arnold node. So most likely we want to stick with Arnold nodes for this. And this is really where the depth of Arnold is shown. Before this, Arnold might appear to be a fairly simple engine, and it is. But if you want control, you can see that you have all sorts of utility nodes and different sorts of shaders. And in reality, you're going to be using very, very few of this. We have a whole chapter on the nodes which are actually useful. Now, they're all useful, but the ones which you're going to be using 18, 90, 95% of the time. So we can also segment this based on, is it a shader? Is it a texture? Like, is it actually like a texture map or a noise? Is it a light? Or is it a general utility which is used to modify something like a shader? Like tons of math nodes and all that, which we really are not going to be concerned with. So if you, for instance, want to make a new standard surface, we can go under Arnold shader and just click standard surface, and now we have created a new standard surface. This is not attached to anything at this time, but we can very easily do that. This is similar to how we did it in the attaching or assigning shaders chapter as well, where we can make a new shader in the Hypershade. We can right click on top of the actual shader, and then we can assign material to viewport selection. This is also why we should name a material, because I have no idea which one this one is on top of these. It's probably the one all the way to the right, because it's number 5, but we can't assume things like that. So we should call this something like cylinder and underscore shader. If you want to call this material, shader, whatever it might be, but now we can easily identify which one it is. We can also clear the graph as well. Sometimes this gets very messy, and we can see we currently have 2 different materials. If you want to clear the entire graph, we can click on this magical vanish icon, and that clears the entire graph. Now, this does not delete any nodes. This just clears it from the entire selection. If we want to get a material back, we can middle mouse button and drag from the materials tab and just drag it down, and now you can see we have the material. The navigation is the same as it is in any 2D editor in Maya, where you Alt middle mouse button to pan around, and you Alt right mouse button to zoom in and out, or you can use the mouse wheel if you prefer to do that. In order to see the input and output, we click on the center icon. The left one is show input, the right one is show output, and the middle one is show input and output. So in this case, we can see that the output of this node is the actual shader group. We know it's the output because it goes out, and it has no inputs because we haven't actually assigned any inputs to this. We can also make new tabs as well. Here we currently have the untitled tab, and we can call this maybe main shading. Then we can make another tab, and we can call this metal shaders. And then in this tab we can have, let's say this is a metal material. This will always be a metal view. So we can look at the main shading here, and then under metal shaders, we can have specific shaders. This is a real nice way of actually organizing your scenes, because your materials can get quite complicated after a long while. The material we're going to be building in the Spartan helmet scene is quite complicated, so we're going to be using this quite heavily, just to really organize what's going on. On the right, we have the material viewer. This is not super useful by default if we're using the hardware, but it is very useful if we switch it from hardware to Arnold. Now we can actually see what's going on, because this is actually being rendered. We can change the model to a cloth. We can change it to an ocean. glass fill, you know, whatever it might be, we can change it to a bunch of different things. And this means that we can very easily actually test our shader on different areas. We can also change the lighting as well, so we can very quickly see it in different environments. This just changes the HDRI. So if you are look doing something, you can, you know, instead of setting it up in a shader or like setting up lights in Maya, you can also use this as a preliminary method of shading. And this will of course be different based on what material you have selected. So if we now want to make this a metal material, we can easily do that. We want to change the roughness up and down. We can very quickly see what's going on without having to do test renders or isolate selected or whatever it might be. We can also pause it by clicking the pause button, because there's no reason to have this going when we're not actually doing anything. It does require CPU power, so there is that. Underneath, we have the general properties. This is where we have, this is the same as we have in the attribute editor. This is exactly the same. Now we have access to the same thing. So instead of having to dock this over and have in two places, we can, for instance, just go into our channel box, and now we have access to both things. So you could dock it like this, or keep the interface something like that, where we have the Hypershade, and then we have the materials as well. What I sometimes tend to do is I tend to kill the create menu, because it takes a lot of space for me. So now I have a lot more real estate to work with. And then if I want to create something, instead of going over to the menu, I just hit the tab key and I search for what I want. If I want an AI standard material, I just search for standard surface, and here we find AI standard surface. You don't have to start with AI standard surface. You can also just hit standard surface and we'll create that. If you want to create a noise, you can look into, you can type tab and noise, and now we can do AI cell noise. And this is how I prefer to do it. Obviously, if you're not very familiar with the different nodes you have, you probably want to use the actual create menu. But once you get used to that, hitting the tab key and then typing is really handy. The reason is because you will be using the same nodes over and over again. So, you know, after just a few hours, you'll know what the nodes are called. Also, the nodes are probably pretty generic in name. So if you want to color correct, you can be pretty sure there is a color correct. So if we just hit tab and then we do color correct, there is indeed a color correct node. If we want to, for instance, have a range, there's probably an AI range node. So it's very predictable. So this is what I often do. If I don't know where it is or something, I can just start typing and just hope that something pops up. And a lot of times it does. So let's look into how we can connect nodes up. If we have this material, the standard surface 2, and we want to connect a file node to this, let's just full screen this. If we want a file node, we can now hit the tab key, and then we can search for file, and we can go down to file and texture. This is the exact same thing we've been doing before when we've been going under surface, clicking the input, and then we're going to file. And you can see that this is now literally the same thing. The only difference is that now it connected it up automatically, and in our case we have to connect it up. But it means that you can work fully within the node editor or the Hypershade in order to create nodes. So if we want to delete something, we select the nodes and we hit the delete key. And if you want to connect something, we can connect the out color to the base. This gets a bit confusing sometimes, because you can see now that if we want this node to connect to something specific, we drag it over, now suddenly we can't actually connect it to everything. And this has to do with what kind of data you can connect up. So if we want to connect this to the specular, we actually can't. But what we can do is, you see the little plus icon? We can now connect one of the actual channels. So if you want to connect the R channel, we can now connect this to the specularity. And the reason is that there is no reason to connect RGB into specularity, because there are 3 channels and it really does the same thing. Like if we have only the red channel, or if we have red, green, and blue into the specularity, that doesn't really matter, because specularity in this case is only a value. So we don't have actually any color in this. This is purely a weight from 0 to 1. So if this is blue, that doesn't really matter. The only thing it cares about is the value. So once I started thinking like that, it became a lot easier, because it's really confusing that certain things, you want this here to go into the specular roughness, and you can't. You can't actually make this go into the specular roughness, but you can if you use the out color red. Now you can easily do that. In order to kill a connection between 2 nodes, you just select the connection and you hit delete, or we can hold down Shift and Alt and we can drag. And now you see we get this nice little cutting action. And this is how I prefer to do it, because now you can cut multiple connections as well. So let's say we want to input this into multiple areas like so, and we have this into several different slots. We can just kill them all by dragging over, Shift Alt, and just drag over. It is pretty similar to just selecting and deleting, but it's just a bit more streamlined. But also what we showed you here is really cool that you can have one file node which connects to multiple different attributes. So for instance, if we have a file node, which it might be a general grunge map, and we want this to connect to the color, the metalness, the specularity, whatever it might be, we don't have to create separate file nodes. We can do this with a single file node. So if we want the same map to be under the color, and we want the same map to be under roughness, we don't have to go under roughness, create file node, and then do that, and then go, connect everything up again. We don't have to do it like that. We can just have the same node connect multiple places. This makes your shading a lot easier, because instead of having two nodes, we would now only have one node, which connects to the same things. Makes it a lot easier, makes Maya easier to work with, and makes it far less likely to actually crash. A little tip is if you want to quickly bring in a bunch of different image maps, in this case, we have 5 maps we want to bring in. It can be really annoying if you have to tab, make a new file node, tab, make a new file node. What we can do, we can select all of them and just drag them in, and there we go. Now you can see that we have file nodes for all of them. I also highly recommend that you name your nodes early on. This is something we have been talking a little bit about, but I highly recommend you actually go in and name them properly. So if this here is, if you make a new file node and you call it's a grunge map, it shouldn't be called grunge 02 because you don't know what kind of node this is. Obviously in this case you can tell that it's a file node, but you won't know that if you're looking at a list. So I would call this grunge 02 underscore file, and you can keep adding this at the end of your file nodes. So now it becomes much easier to actually see what's going on. If we were to look at this in a list, let's say we're looking at this in the outliner, tag objects only, and now we can see that we have file, and we clearly know what these are. Obviously, this is crazy overkill for most things, but it's a really good idea to keep your scenes very organized. A handy feature as well is that once our scenes become complicated and we have a bunch of unused nodes, we can delete the unused nodes. We do that by going to Edit, Delete Unused Nodes, and now you can see that a lot of stuff is going to disappear. And that's because they're not connected to anything. They're just floating around, and if they're just floating around without being connected to anything, then there is no reason for them to actually exist. So we'll be using the Hypershade a lot in this series, and I highly recommend that you get used to using it. If you find it to be a bit awkward and a bit old, well, that's not because you're weird, that's because it's a bit awkward and a bit old. So you can also go to Window and Node Editor, and you can use this instead if you really prefer it. This is not specifically made for shading, this is more made for general scene management, but you can 100% do the same things. So now we can, for instance, bring in the material, we can go and we can get the shader group, we can get the input and output, and then we can see the different materials we have. And then if we click on these buttons, we can now expand and contract the selection. This is exactly the same in Hypershade as well, and a lot of these are exactly the same. But this just means that we can now actually see all the attributes available. So this is a bit more modern, and it's a lot easier to actually open. It doesn't actually take, it opens when you actually click it. It doesn't take 5 seconds to open. But we are going to be using Hypershade in this series. But if you prefer, you can also use this.